week, and maybe a little into the final week in week 6 before we finish with the book of Ruth and the story of Ruth. There are 12 major judges and there are 12 judges in the book of Judges, 6 major judges and 6 minor judges. So where we're at in our story after the end of the book of Joshua and the story of Joshua, the Israelites have divided up the promised land among the tribes. Like I said last week, you've probably got one of these kind of maps in the back of your Bible showing the different divisions of the tribes. We ended with the end of Joshua, where he is giving his farewell address to the Israelite people. He said, "Then I sent Moses, Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there, and I brought you out." This is God talking. "I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived east of the Jordan. They fought against you, but I gave them into your hands. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. I gave them into your hands." And then Joshua's admonition to them here: "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." We ended with this thought last week. I was talking about how this is a real difference in choices here that the Israelites are being asked to make. This is different because normally God is the subject. God is the one who chooses Israel. God is the one who chooses his people. But now they're being asked to choose God. And this is different than all the other people that live in this land. He's talking about the Amorites, the Canaanites, all these different people in whose land they're currently living, in whose land they have currently conquered or taken over. And those people face a choice every day. Which god or goddess do I worship today? Well, it's coming up to harvest time, so I'm going to worship this goddess today. It's coming up to this holiday, so I'm going to worship this god today. My kid is sick, so I'm going to worship this god today. That's the practice of the people of the land in whose land the Israelites are living. They choose different gods and goddesses kind of on a whim according to their own needs. But what Joshua is telling them is you need to choose God and God alone for everything. God has chosen us. Now it's time for you to choose God back. So he asked them to make that choice. I mentioned last week probably a lot of you have something like this in your house or have seen people with it. And this again goes back to this corporate idea of the covenant, that this is not an individualistic thing. Notice that Joshua says, "As for me and my household." Later when we get to the New Testament, we see Peter, Paul, converting people and baptizing entire households. Households are choosing, families are choosing. It's a corporate decision that they make and that they're being asked to make by Joshua here. He says, "My household, my family is choosing God. It's time for you to do the same." So there again is that corporate aspect to the covenant. It's not, I mentioned last week, it's sometimes hard for us as Christians to understand that because we think more in terms of like individuals, personal. It's my personal faith. It's my personal choice to choose Jesus. And that is true, but I think as Christians sometimes we miss out on the corporate aspect of faith, the corporate aspect of choosing to follow God. Obviously, we come here to Landmark. We come here to be a family on Sunday mornings, Wednesday nights. We are choosing to be a part of a family here. And so we have some aspects of that in our lives. We're not devoid of it completely. But again, Joshua is asking them to make a kind of group decision here. And then of course the people respond positively. "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods." Well, we already know that they're going to do exactly that. Joshua tries to tell them again, if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you. So Joshua again here, just like Moses in his farewell address, when Moses in the plains of Moab, the plains of the Jordan Valley, is telling the Israelites, choose God, choose to follow his commandments, keep his commandments, no matter what you do when you go into the promised land. They go into the promised land and they don't always follow it. Now Joshua here at the end of his life is giving his farewell address. He's like, please choose God, follow the laws, follow the commandments. They're meant for your own good. They are sweeter than honey, like Psalm says. They are your very life, Moses says. So Joshua here is admonishing them, please, this is for your own good to do this. And of course, Joshua knows, even when they respond, oh, of course we're going to do that. Of course we're going to choose God. Of course we're always going to be obedient. Joshua knows that that's not going to be the case. Now then, said Joshua, throw away the foreign gods that are among you and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people, and there at Shechem he reaffirmed for them the decrees and laws. So when they first came over into the promised land, remember they conquered Jericho. They failed to conquur Ai, but then they eventually conquered after the ambush. They go up to Shechem and they renew the covenant. Now, all these years later, after the conquering of the promised land, at the end of Joshua's life here, he again is back at Shechem with them, with the leaders of the tribes of Israel, and asking them to renew the covenant with him. And so Joshua dies, age 110. He's buried. Israel served the Lord through the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. So now we enter the time of the judges. Now we are past the time of a leader, a consistent leader for the Israelite people. They were in slavery for 400 years in Egypt. Then Moses brings them out and leads them for 40 years. After Moses dies, Joshua takes over. And all these years later, these decades later, after this, now Joshua is gone. Joshua has died. Caleb provides a tiny bit of leadership kind of at the beginning of the time period of the judges. The time period of the judges is going to last a couple hundred years. So this is going to be a time of really, all the tribes are split up, like that map we looked at, and this one kind of has it on here as well. I know you can't see that very well yet on the screen without it being up on the big screen, but this map, when you get the slides later, when I send them to you, you can see on this map it has the names of each of the 12 judges and kind of the general region where their stories take place. I mentioned there's 6 major judges, 6 minor judges. Here's another one that just has the major judges on it. So Samson's down there, Ehud, Jephthah, Gideon, Deborah, and Othniel are all on this map. But the tribes are all split among, they've each gotten their land of inheritance that God had promised to them. They are living for the most part separately. We don't have a consistent place for the ark yet. They haven't fully established Shiloh as the place where the tabernacle was going to sit. So the ark kind of travels around to different shrines or holy places throughout the land. The tribes are all split up. We see over and over again in the book of Judges that even when the judge comes, the rescuer, the redeemer, the savior that God sends, when they come to rescue the Israelite people, they beg the other tribes to come help. And for the most part, they get very little response from the other tribes to come and help. This is very much, somebody I saw compared it to like the time period of America when we were under the Articles of Confederation from like, what would that have been, 1777 to 1788? Is that what it was? Well, anyway, that time period when before the Constitution, we were under the Articles of Confederation, where the states were the ones with just all the power. That's kind of what you're seeing here. There's no central leader. There's no central holy place or holy city yet at this point. All the tribes are just kind of living on their own, doing their own thing. So much so that when the other tribes ask for help, when they're being oppressed and they ask for help, a lot of times the other tribes don't even respond or go to help. So here at the beginning of the book of Judges, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, who of us is to go up first to fight the Canaanites? And you may ask yourself, wait, I thought they spent the entire book of Joshua conquering the Canaanites. Well, this is our first clue that they didn't. Like they failed to do the things that God had asked them to do, that they didn't always have success. They didn't always do the things that God had commanded them to do when they got to the promised land. And so we have, from the very beginning in the book of Judges here, we have our first clue that, oh, wait, they're still fighting against the Canaanites? There's still a problem for them? And we're going to see the people of this land still be a problem for the Israelites throughout the book of Judges. The Lord answered, Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands. The men of Judah then said to the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, come up with us into the territory allotted to us to fight against the Canaanites. We in turn will go with you into yours. So the Simeonites went with them. So again, here's that bartering, like, hey, if you come help us right now, we'll go help you when you need it. And this is just between two tribes at this point. When Judah attacked, the Lord gave the Canaanites and Perizzites into their hands, and they struck down 10,000 men at Bezek. It was there that they found Adoni-Bezek and fought against him, putting to rout the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they chased him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Then Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. So here's what's happening. This king, Adoni-Bezek, is the one they're fighting against. When they catch him and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes, basically what he says is, there were 70 other kings or leaders of other people groups in this region that I fought against, that I captured, and I cut off their thumbs and big toes. Now it's happened to me. That's basically what he's saying. I've gotten what I've deserved here by having my thumbs and big toes cut off. We don't really have any other reason that the Israelites would do this other than that they must know that he was famous for doing this to others. We don't really see this happen somewhere else. This is not a usual practice of the Israelites. I do want to stop here and say one thing about tonight. This I mentioned this before. Here's the movie Risen that came out what did it say, 2016. It's about a Roman centurion soldier who sees the death of Jesus, sees that Jesus has risen, changes his life. Obviously, it's fiction, but it's a very interesting story, like to think about from a perspective of a Roman centurion. What would happen to a Roman centurion's life if they saw Jesus crucified and then believed that he rose from the dead? So that's what the movie's about. But it always made me laugh that if you look on here at the rating, like, for the movie, it says it's rated PG-13 for biblical violence. I never knew why they distinguished the biblical violence in this movie from just normal violence. I guess to tell us, like, well, it's very violent, but we are trying to portray the Bible, so I guess that's what they had in mind. So I do want to say that tonight is rated PG-13 for biblical violence. And when I say biblical violence, I really just mean violence, but we are going to be looking at the Bible, so keep that in mind. Example of that, here's Adoni-Bezek with his thumbs and big toes. There's more cut off here. We read thumbs and big toes. Clearly, this artist is taking the Hebrew and imagining it as cutting off kind of at the elbows and the knees, not just the thumbs or big toes. This is one on the right. On the left, the cartoon, he's just missing his thumbs and big toes. But so what's that? The thumb suckers. Yeah, he must have clearly been. So here, we're going to read through this real quick, but notice the language here that it talks about with the Israelite people. The tribes were supposed to drive out all those living in the land, but look what the beginning of Judges tells us. They were unable to drive the people from the plains. The Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites. Manasseh did not drive out the people of Beth-shan or Tanakh or Dor or Ebelim or Megiddo and their surrounding settlements. Never drove them out completely, nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them. Neither did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron and Nahal, so these Canaanites lived among them. Nor did Asher drive out those living in Akko or Sidon or Ahab or Itzlab or Helba or Aphek or Rehob. The Asherites lived among the Canaanites, inhabitants of the lands, because they did not drive them out. Neither did Naphtali drive out those living in Beit Shemesh or Beit Anath, but the Naphtalites who too lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land. So over and over again, we're told they basically failed at what they were supposed to do. They didn't drive out these people, which tells us what? They are living among them. So there, and even Joshua at the end, he recognizes this. Choose for yourselves this day who you will serve, whether it's the God of the Ammonites in whose land you are living. So even Joshua recognizes that this is the woo bright lights here. But we got it up though. It looks like We'll try and get to a darker slide here in a second. So keep that in mind. They are living amongst the people of this land. What does that tell us? They're going to be friends with those people. They naturally become friends with them. They trade with them. They try to live in peace with them for the most part. So what does that mean for them also? They could easily begin to worship the gods and goddesses of those people. Hey, I saw you had a good crop last year. Oh, yeah, I prayed to Asherah. I got this Asherah pole right here. Or I prayed to Baal. I got this altar over here to Baal, and I prayed to him. And all of a sudden you got Israelites saying, I could use a better crop this year. Maybe I'll do the same thing. So that's the situation we run into here in Judges. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you to the land I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. You have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? Now I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who lived with him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. And then pay attention to this. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. So this is our first clue that the Israelite people are going to become forgetful. They're going to forget all that God had done for them. We're going to look in a second of this cycle that happens over and over and over again throughout the book of Judges. And the first step of that cycle is the people become forgetful. The Israelites forget all that God had done for them, and then they become sinful. They forget what God had done for them, and they begin to worship the gods and goddesses, the idols of their neighbors, the people in whose land they're currently living. Verse 14, in his anger against the Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. The NIV does a good job here choosing that word sold, because usually what you read is the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines or the Canaanites, the Midianites. But the word is much harsher in the original language. So sold is kind of more accurate. It's a harsher word. The Lord sold them into oppression by their neighbors. But then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Remember that, here's that callback here of that word that's used that we originally saw with Rahab. That just as Rahab prostituted herself, so we see later that the Israelites will prostitute themselves to these idols. And just as Rahab could be elevated up out of that, so the author wants to remind the Israelites that so too can the Israelites, even when they fail, be elevated back into right relationship with God. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. But when the judge died, the people returned to their ways. So we have these stories. I mentioned this before. We have that word judge that automatically we think of in judicial terms, sitting in a courtroom. But the word is really redeemer, rescuer, savior. So here we have this, stories of deliverers. There was a church who did a sermon series on the book of Judges, and they called their sermon series Broken Saviors. And I kind of like that, because that's what we read about for the most part. Really, the only one that probably doesn't fall under that is Deborah. We'll talk about her story tonight, but she's probably the only one that's not a broken savior. She is elevated really by the author as kind of one of the best of the judges. But certainly many of the others, as I mentioned, the judges are some pretty great people and a few jerks and idiots. So we're going to see some broken saviors. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. So here's the cycle of judges again. People fall into sin and idolatry. God gets angry. There's oppression by their enemies. The people cry out to God. God sends a judge to save them. There's a time of peace. The judge dies. The people fall into sin and idolatry. God is angry. The cycle continues. Here's some other demonstrations of that. The people sinned, doing what they saw fit in their own eyes. This cycle chooses that language because that's how the book of Judges is going to end. They did what they saw fit in their own eyes. Here's one that's a little bigger. It's probably easier to see. Israel commits sin. God allows Israel to be oppressed. Israel repents and cries out to God. God sends a judge to deliver them. Israel is faithful while the judge lives. So if you were in that Wednesday night class with me a number of years ago, you know when we went through the book of Judges, we talked about this. The people become forgetful. They are oppressed. They cry out to God. God sends a savior, a rescuer, a redeemer, a judge. There was a time of peace. Most of the judges, we always hear, they lived, and there was peace for 7 years. There was peace for 40 years. But after that time of peace, what naturally happens? The people become forgetful. So they stop following God. They get oppressed by their neighbors. They crawl out to God. God sends a savior. There's a time of peace. Then they become forgetful over and over and over again. We'll skip this one. Oh, whoops. Wait. I do want to go back to that. Okay, verse 4, they were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's commandments, which he had given their ancestors through Moses. And then look at verse 6. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. So everything that they were told not to do. Don't intermarry your children with them and don't start to worship their gods. And Judges tells us here right at the beginning, that's exactly what they did. So we have this cycle set up for us by the book of Judges. Here's what's going to happen. Our first story of a major judge with Othniel, his story really is just showing us exactly the cycle happening. So note, here's Othniel's story. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Asherahs. This is just foreign gods and goddesses. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram-Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. So they were living under this oppression by this king, this neighboring king, for 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came on him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So Othniel's story really, we don't know much about this guy. He's one of the major judges. There was a brief story about him even before this. We're not going to go over it tonight. But there's a brief part of his story before this. But other than that, we don't know a whole lot about the guy. But the author of Judges puts his story first of the judges to just set up the scenario again. The author told us what the cycle was going to be in chapter 2. Now with the very first story of a judge, Othniel, he lays it out again. Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They became forgetful. They forgot all that the Lord had done for them. They started worshiping these other gods and goddesses. So what happens? They're oppressed by a neighboring king. Then what happens? They cry out to God to rescue them. Then what happens? God sends a rescuer. Then what happens? A time of peace. Then what happens? The judge dies, they become forgetful, and the cycle starts all over again. What's that? Yeah. Really, it's not much different than today. What's the point being made here for those of you online is, we probably see the same thing in our own lives. We become forgetful of all that God has done for us. Then we have to call out to God to rescue us, to send us healing. And God does. But then what happens? We become forgetful. So here's our next judge, a man named Ehud, but we'll call him Ehud. And this is right after, you don't have to go back, Jared, but look right at the end here, verse 11. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. The very next verse. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Because they did evil in the eyes of the Lord, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. So they became forgetful, they became sinful. Right away, they fall under this oppression from this neighboring king. Getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. The Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. Again, the Israelites cried out to God. Here's continuing the cycle here. They call out to God, and he rescued them. He gave them a deliverer. Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjamite. The Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Do we have any left-handers in here? Who's the left-hander? Oh, only one left-hander? Wow. And she raised her left hand. So that we believe you. If you had raised your right hand, I don't know if we would have believed you there, but okay, so we got a left-hander in the Bible here, which actually, in English, it says a left-handed man. What it actually says in the original language is whose right hand was bound. What that means, so that tells us probably that Ehud is not born left-handed. What he is, he's a Benjamite. Later, next week, maybe at the beginning of week 6, when we get to the story of the Benjamites, there's 700 Benjamites who are famous with their slings, like the same kind of sling that David used. They're famous with their slings. They're all left-handed. So they trained themselves to be left-handed. The Benjamites were kind of known for doing this. They would train their specific fighters to go from being right-handed to fighting left-handed, because it gave them an advantage in battle. Everybody else they were fighting against trains to fight right-handed men, trains to fight right-handed people. So they were trained, they were sword on shield. When you're fighting, sword on shield, shield against sword. But when you're fighting a left-hander, you're going sword against sword, shield against shield, and it would throw you off. I don't know if you remember the movie Rocky very much. This is the famous scene from the end of Rocky 3. But you'll notice that Apollo Creed is right-handed, Rocky is left-handed. That's the famous, frozen scene at the end of Rocky 3 there, where they're about to have this sparring match, and it's this freeze frame at the end of the movie of them swinging at each other, Apollo right-handed, Rocky left-handed. And this is a big thing. In the first Rocky movie, the big concern from Apollo Creed's team is that Rocky's left-handed. He's a southpaw, and they think, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't fight a southpaw. It's going to throw you off. He's going to have the advantage by being left-handed. But Apollo Creed says, no, this is too perfect. We're going to fight Rocky. So, spoiler alert, it's been almost 40 years? almost 50 years, so since Rocky, 1976. So, if you haven't seen it, I don't feel bad spoiling it. But they basically, Apollo wins by decision at the end of the first movie. So in the rematch in Rocky 2, what does Rocky's trainer Mickey tell him to do? To learn to fight right-handed. Because Apollo's now going to expect him to be fighting left-handed. So he kind of switches it up again to regain the advantage. He's going to be expecting to fight a southpaw. So now you come out and fight right-handed until he tires out. Then you switch back to your dominant left-handed fighting stance. So the Benjamites essentially all these years ago are doing something very similar here, is they train themselves to fight left-handed to have the advantage in battle. So what they would do is they would bind, there's actually a scene from Rocky 2 where Mickey binds Rocky's arm so that he can't use the arm that he wants to. So that's what the Benjamites would do. You bound your right arm. So when it says Ehud is left-handed, what it really says is he had his right hand bound. Like, not currently, but it means like in the past, he had bound his right hand to become left-handed. But in English, we normally just translate it as he's a left-handed man, because he basically is now. Even if he wasn't born left-handed, he is fighting and doing things left-handed in his life. Now, Ehud had made a double-edged sword about a cubit long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. So notice that. He's left-handed, so where does the sword go? His right thigh. That's going to come into play here in a minute. We'll come back to that. But notice also the sword he makes. It's a cubit long, so again, it's like 18 inches. So it's not some like long broadsword or something like that. And it's not one of the common at the time sickle swords, which was a striking weapon. It was like a curved blade. You swung it at people. You struck them with it because it only had one blade. This is a double-edged sword, so it's a stabbing weapon. It's short, it's 18 inches long, and it's double-edged, so it's meant to stab someone. Again, that's going to come back. Rated PG-13, biblical violence, remember. So he hides the sword on his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribute that he was sent with to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. After Ehud had presented the tribute, he went on their way. He sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone images near Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon and said, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." The king said to his attendants, "Leave us." And they all left. Here's what I think we all picture. Like that scene in Star Wars, in Return of the Jedi, when they're at Jabba the Hutt's place. That's the scene that's kind of being set here with Eglon, this king. So Ehud comes, he presents this tribute, says, "Hey, we just want to show good faith, make a peace offering here." He leaves, but then he comes back. He says, "Hey, king, I got a secret message for you." And the king sends everybody out, which to us is like, what? That seems dumb. Why are you sending your secret service out of the room? Your guards, your protectors. But by a secret message, the implication is that Ehud is going to give him military information, military intelligence to fight against his own people. So the king sends everybody out so that he can hear directly from Ehud what this secret information is that he can use to further oppress the Israelites. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace and said, "I have a message from God for you." As the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. So remember, if the guards are checking people, they're not just going to let anybody into the throne room however they want. They're going to check them for weapons. But where are they going to check? They're going to check his left thigh because they're going to assume he's right-handed. So you would have a sword on your left thigh. But Ehud, using his left hand, has the sword on his right thigh. So it flies under the radar of the guards, and he gets it into this private meeting with the king here. He draws the sword, he plunges it into the king's belly. It says, "Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. Then Ehud went out to the porch, he shut the doors of the upper room behind him, and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. They said he must be relieving himself in the inner room of the palace. They waited to the point of embarrassment. But when they did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them. There they saw their lord fall into the floor dead." So Ehud plunges the sword into the King Eglon here. It says he didn't pull the sword out. So there's some pictures, and people often portray this scene with like a bunch of blood around, but really, because he plunged the sword in and left it in, it was almost like a cork in a wine bottle. Like it would have kept the blood in. But what came out was not blood. It said his bowels discharged. In fact, in the Hebrew, it said it went through the anus. So he basically plunged his sword all the way through this king. Now, the reason that matters is because the guards who are outside smell this and think, "Oh, he's just relieving himself in there, so we're not going to knock on the door, we're not going to disturb him." It says that Ehud went out the porch or the portico. That's not really the best English word to use there. Here's kind of a diagram of what this room would have looked like. Notice there in kind of the middle to left of middle there's the word toilet. That's kind of the private toilet the king would have had in this room. Here's got maybe a better version. You can't probably read the writing on here, but you can look at it later when I send you the slides. But again, it lays out this room where the king and Ehud are having this private conversation. But within this room, there's a toilet only meant for the king. So that's why after Ehud leaves, and what he would have done was he would have gone through the toilet. You ever use a pit toilet, like at a camp or a camp spot or something like that? I imagine none of you crawled down into it, but that's essentially what Ehud does here. He crawls down into it, goes out like basically the janitor's closet door, and walks out so that he would have been seen. Because if he doesn't come out for a long time, the guards would begin to really wonder, we can't leave our king in there with this random dude for this long. We better go in there and make sure the king is okay. But because Ehud comes strolling out, just like he went down through this like elevated toilet area and out the janitor's closet door and walked right out the way he came in, everybody would have seen him leave and thought, "Oh, okay, their conversation is over." Then what do the guards do? They go up to the door, knock on the door and one's like, "Do you smell that?" And the other's like, "What, am I hard of smelling? Of course I smell. We better leave this guy alone." So that's essentially why they leave him alone so long. That matters because it allows Ehud time to go escape and gather the troops, so to speak. But obviously this is meant to be, in a lot of ways, even though it's kind of gross and gruesome, biblical violence, the story is meant to be somewhat comical. This is probably the author of Judges' way to get the kids of the Israelites to listen to these stories, because everything's passed down orally. They're telling these stories. So what kid wouldn't love to tell this story over and over again, you know? Here's the Lego version. Again, on the right there, you see the little red Legos showing his blood, but again, that probably wouldn't have happened. The sword he stabs him and he leaves the sword in. Blood stays in, other stuff comes out. While they waited, Ehud got away. He passed by the stone images and escaped to Sarah. When he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. "Follow me," he ordered, "for the Lord has given Moab, your enemy, into your hands." So they followed him down and took possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab. They allowed no one to cross over. At that time, they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong. Not one escaped. That day, Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. Can you guess what happens next after the peace? The people become forgetful. But before that, we're going to take a look at, do we have this video, Jer? Is it ready? Okay, cool. We're going to take a look at this video. We got a couple of them tonight. They're all like 3 minutes long. This video is done in the style of, if you ever saw Rocky and Bullwinkle back in the day, they did a thing called fractured fairy tales, where they would tell fairy tales, but just kind of funny perspective. So these videos tonight are in that same fashion by this Christian group. So here's Ehud's dark left turn story.
After the death of Joshua, the children of Israel once again started to sin. Idol worship, displeasing to the Lord. Stealing, also displeasing to the Lord, and generally not cool. Without God's help, the Moabites took over.
This can't last. Someone has to fight against this. Obviously not me.
Beating up Israelites, just generally not cool. Displeasing to everyone.
So you Israelites just decided to send King Eglon a present.
Out of the goodness of our hearts.
It's gonna take more than a present to get you guys out of this mess. King Eglon, the Israelites have a gift for you.
Presents?
I also have a message for you, King.
For me?
A secret message.
Secret message? He has a secret message! Out! Everybody out!
It's a message from God.
King Eglon?
I'm sure he's fine. Follow me! God has given the Moabites into our hands.
And with the king of the Moabites out of the picture, the judge Ehud led the Israelites for 80 years of peace. Until the Israelites started sinning again, lost God's favor, got conquered, turned back to God, and started the cycle of judges all over again in Deborah versus the Canaanites.
We'll get to Deborah's story in a minute, but that's Ehud. Right after the story of Ehud, we just have this verse. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. Needless to say, Shamgar is one of the minor judges, because that's all we got about this guy. That's the only passage we got. In fact, it's the only place in the Bible that the word is used that we translate here, ox goad. We don't actually know what that means. In fact, if you look at portrayals of this judge in this story, they got all kinds of different weapons looking here. Like on the left there is like almost like a baton, like you see like a marching band leader use. The one on the right's got at least a sharp point on it. On this one, like on the left, it's like point in. Like some people think an ox goad was something like that you used to like hold two oxen together, like to do your farming, and he took this off and sharpened it or something like that. Again, we have no idea what this weapon is that he used to kill these Philistines here. Notice we don't even have the pattern really here that we have with the other judges of reminding us the people became forgetful, they were oppressed, they cried out to God. God sent a redeemer, rescuer. There was a time of peace. They become forgetful. We don't get any of that with Shamgar's story. It's just, hey, there was a guy Shamgar, and he fought a couple of Israelites with some kind of weapon. We don't really know what it is. And there was a time of peace, and he too saved Israel. We actually don't even know if Shamgar's an Israelite. There's something in that he's actually Egyptian, and it's kind of the enemy is my friend. Like, basically, Shamgar's an Egyptian and was fighting against the Philistines, who were the enemy of the Israelites. And so God used a foreign person, an Egyptian, to rescue the Israelite people. But that's basically all we got about Shamgar. Any questions or comments? Probably not about Shamgar, but Ehud, Othniel, the judges in general? Yeah. Got a microphone there?
Should I use this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, early on you mentioned how the tribes were really disjointed. They weren't necessarily helping one another. They weren't really acting as a unit. And yet now all of a sudden, it just keeps saying the Israelites did this and the Israelites did that. How did they suddenly become a unit again and not just the Benjamites did this or the whatever's did this?
Yeah, it's probably just using the term generically because the Israelites are under the covenant of God. So we know that almost the entire time that God sends a rescuer, that the people cry out, it's as a couple of tribes. And even those judges that come to rescue them are only able to band together a few of the tribes. But the message seems to be from the author that even though it's only a couple of tribes being affected, this really affects the entire nation of Israel. Because if these people, like in this case, the Philistines or the Midianites or the Amorites, like they're allowed to persecute this tribe or these couple of tribes, eventually that's going to mean the persecution of all the nation of Israel, all 12 tribes. So the fact that they're defeated is good for all Israelites. So it's probably, the author using it generically, but you're right. It's really only speaking specifically to a couple of the tribes at a time normally under each of these judges. Any other question or comments? Okay. There's two women in our Bible, or in our Protestant Bible at least, who are called most blessed among women. Probably won't really surprise you to know that one of them is Mary, the mother of Jesus. In a loud voice, Elizabeth exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women." The one on the left has, "Most blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." So Mary, the mother of Jesus, is one of the two women in our Bible that is called most blessed among women. So here we get to the story of the other woman who is called that. I put the cycle back up here again because the story of Deborah begins, according to the cycle of Book of Judges, again, this is right after Shamgar, again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. Sisera, the commander of his army, essentially his general, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried out to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. So here's the one exception to the word judge actually being something judicial. Deborah's the only judge that seems to serve as a judge in multiple ways: a military leader, a prophet, an actual judicial judge that decided disputes between people. The other judges really fulfill like one of those roles. Deborah seems to fulfill like kind of everything it means to be a judge here, including this judicial role of helping people to settle disputes. A couple things in this verse I want to point out. It says, Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth. It says wife of Lapidoth. What the text actually says is a woman of torches. It says a woman of Lapidoth. Lapidoth means torches or fire. So we don't know if she's actually married to a man named Lapidoth, or this is a description of her. Deborah, a prophet, a woman of torches. In other words, she's a fiery, spirited woman. So we don't know which it actually is. Is she married to a man named Lapidoth, or is she a woman of torches, a fiery, spirited woman? She's leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah. I guess it's convenient to have it named after yourself. Like, we don't actually know if it's named after her. There's a Deborah, if you look in Genesis chapter 35, Rebecca, Isaac's wife, has a nurse named Deborah. When she dies in this area right near Bethel, they bury her under a tree and call it basically the tree of sorrows, the tree of Deborah. So it may be that that's where this Deborah is sitting and allowing people to come to her for judgment, for advice, for prophecy. So the Israelites go up to her. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh and Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands. Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. Certainly I will go with you, said Deborah, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours. For the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went with him. So notice again, only a few of the tribes are summoned here. Only a few of the tribes are going to be fighting this fight. And again, Deborah here, Barak, I think, sometimes gets a little bit of a bad rap in this situation because he kind of looks like a coward. Like, Deborah tells him, the Lord's calling you to go lead the Israelite people against Sisera, this general for this king up in Hatzor, and to fight against him. And he'll deliver him into your hands. And Barak says, well, if you go, then I'll go. But if you're not going to go, then I'm not going to go. And he kind of looks like a coward, but it probably is not cowardice that is making him say this. It's actually his respect for Deborah as a prophet. He knows that she is the messenger for God, that she is the prophet and the prophetess who communicates God's message to the people. So, of course, he wants her to go with them. If you've ever seen, there was a movie called, Hacksaw Ridge, came out a few years ago. It's a story of a man in World War II. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, so he volunteers to be a medic because he doesn't want to actually fight, like be involved in the violence, but he serves as a medic and is out there on the field, like helping the soldiers who do get injured. And there's a scene towards the end where none of the soldiers want to go into battle without him going with them, because they know that what he brings to the table, he knows that he's rescuing all these people, and they see him almost kind of like a good luck charm. So they don't want to go into battle without him. This is kind of the same thing for Barak here. He's like, you should come. You should come. I know that you are the voice of God, and I want you with him. So it's not that he's scared to go or kind of a coward, but he recognizes Deborah's position with God. So here's a look. This is the Jezreel Valley in Israel. And on this picture, it's got some things labeled on here. Mount Tabor, Nazareth, Mount Moreh, Mount Gilboa. We'll come to Mount Moreh and Mount Gilboa with the story of Gideon. There's an arrow on the far left, like in the middle, and it's an arrow that underneath it says Kishon River. So that's the river that it's talking about running through the Jezreel Valley. That's going to be a part of our story here. This is another picture. It's actually looking from a place called Megiddo. If you've been to Israel with me, you've been to this spot and looked out here. That red arrow pointing down is pointing to Nazareth. That was called the Nazareth Ridge. The green arrow in the middle is this like little rounded bump. That's Mount Tabor. That's where the story of Deborah is going to be taking place here. It's actually also the traditional site of the Transfiguration from the time of Jesus. But right now we're concerned with Deborah and Barak. And on the far right there is Mount Moreh. Again, that's going to come back with the story of Gideon. But the reason I show this picture is because it's showing from Megiddo across this plain, this large flat plain here called the Jezreel Valley. Megiddo, Har Megiddo means Mount Megiddo. Har Megiddo, when it's run together over the years, becomes Armageddon. So when you're talking about Armageddon, the plains of Armageddon, that's what is where you're at here with Megiddo. So in the Jezreel Valley, over thousands and thousands of years, thousands and thousands of battles have been fought here. Because this is what you needed to control. Here's kind of an aerial view or a map view here. It looks like an arrowhead, kind of the shape of the Jezreel Valley. But it takes up most of this section of the land of Israel, of the promised land. So for thousands of years, this is what you wanted to control. You needed to control the Jezreel Valley. Here's another look at it with kind of all the entrances and exits coming into and out of the Jezreel Valley. So if you're coming from the north, if you're coming from the east, you're coming from the south, like where Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Rome, all these different opposing empires would come from. What you wanted to do was capture the Jezreel Valley. So it was a really important military advantage to control the Jezreel Valley. So that's where this battle is going to be fought, with Deborah and Barak against Sisera. Here's just a more simplified version of the Jezreel Valley. The only thing to note on here is just the landmarks all around it. Mount Tabor, the Kishon Pass, like Megiddo. So it's this, there's a natural boundary all around this valley, and you wanted to capture the middle of it. So when the Kenites told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. So essentially what happens here, Deborah, I mean, you can almost imagine kind of the jokes that Sisera and his people would have been thinking, like, these Israelites, they're letting themselves be led by a woman? This woman is going to be the one to fight against us, lead them against us? And probably think this is a ridiculous proposition, that this is going to be an easy victory. And normally it would have been. I mean, Sisera has 900 chariots. That is an incredible advantage, especially in a large, flat plain. It's not like they're trying to go up hills and over mountains and stuff like that. It's a large, flat plain. So 900 chariots is a massive military advantage for Sisera. Now, what Deborah knows that Sisera does not is that a freak storm has occurred, and it overflowed the Kishon River, making this whole wide, flat valley muddy. So the chariots are going to get stuck in the mud, basically just trapped there, making them sitting ducks for the Israelites to defeat them. So where the cockiness of Sisera to think this is going to be an easy victory, he doesn't know what Deborah knows, which is this freak summer. So I say freak summer storm kind of in quotes. I mean, obviously, it could have been sent by God. Maybe it's just the timing is right. The storm happened, so that's why God comes to Deborah and says, "Tell Barak to do it now. This is the right time to do it." They don't know that the valley is flooded from this storm here. So then we go into the Song of Deborah. So chapter 4 in Judges is what's called the prose part of the story. It's telling the story. Chapter 5 is called the Song of Deborah. It's the poem part of the story. Now, what's interesting about that is just like when we talked about the Song of Miriam, from the book of Exodus. Remember, they pass through the Red Sea. The waters close in over the Egyptian army and swallow up their chariots. And after that, Miriam, with her timbrel or tambourine, leads a song, the Song of Miriam. The horse and rider he is thrown into the sea. We mentioned then, and it's true here, that the poem part of this is actually the older part. So it's actually, Judges chapter 5 is one of the oldest pieces of literature we have from the entire Bible. It goes back, and that makes sense. If you are passing stories down orally in an oral tradition, of course you would have these poems, these songs that you would sing to make it easier to tell these stories amongst your people. So the Song of Deborah says, on that day, Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang this song. When the princes in Israel take the lead, when the Lord willingly offers themselves, praise the Lord. Hear this, you kings. Listen, you rulers. Even I, will sing to the Lord. I will praise the Lord, the God of Israel, in song. Villagers in Israel would not fight. They held back until I, Deborah, arose, until I arose, a mother in Israel. My heart is with Israel's princes, with the willing volunteers among the people. Praise the Lord. Consider the voice of the singers of the watering places. That's the places in the valley here, the ones that overflowed. They recite the victories of the Lord, the victories of his villagers in Israel. Then the people of the Lord went down to the city gates. Wake up, Deborah. Wake up, break out in song. Arise, Barak, take captive your captives, son of Abinoam. Kings came, they fought. The kings of Canaan fought at Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They took no plunder of silver. From the heavens the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The river Kishon swept them away. Notice the allusion there to the Egyptian chariots being swept away in the Song of Miriam. Now we have the author of Judges in this poem, this Song of Deborah, recalling that. Just as God swept the Egyptian army away in their chariots, so God has swept away the army of Sisera here. The age-old river, the river Kishon, march on, my soul, be strong. Then thundered the horses' hooves, galloping, galloping, go as mighty steeds. So may all your enemies perish, Lord, but may all who love you be like the sun when it rises in strength. Then the land had peace for 40 years. So, of course, we see the greatness of Deborah. We see it in the song. We see it that she's a prophet. We see what a remarkable leader she is. But she's not the one called most blessed among women. You know, we had Mary, the mother of Jesus, is one of them. The other is not Deborah. Judges chapter 5, verse 24. Most blessed of women be Jael. It's probably more pronounced Yael, but we'll just say Jael because that's how we spell it in English. So who in the world is this Jael? Who in the world is this one other besides Mary, the mother of Jesus, this woman to be called most blessed among women? We go back to her story. We kind of skipped over it. Now we're backtracking to her story. Back in chapter 4. Barak pursued the chariots. This is after the defeat. Everybody's been killed except Sisera, the general of the opposing army. So Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hatzor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone there?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Last part's like, well, no, duh. I'm not sure we needed the specification there at the end that he's dead, but they give it anyway. So Jael, Sisera, this general, his army's defeated. He's escaping away. He must think, oh, thank you to whatever gods and goddesses I worship that I have come across an ally, a friendly tent here. Like, I have come across, this is, I know this tent. I know this settlement. It is Heber the Kenite settlement. So he approaches it. Heber is not there, but his wife Jael is there. So he is thinking, well, this is good. I'm going to get hospitality here. I've mentioned before, that from Psalm 23, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The picture is from desert hospitality rules at this time. If you enter somebody's tent, no matter what pursuer, the law, an opposing army comes to that tent, they can't go in the tent to bring you out. They have to wait till you come out. It was just kind of a hospitality rule that everybody honored. And so in Psalm 23, thou prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The picture is I'm in this tent having this meal served before me. My enemies are standing at the door looking in, and I'm sitting here with this table in front of me. So Sisera must be elated. Like, this is great. I can rest. I can go in here and rest and get some food or something, some energy. She tells him, come in, don't be afraid. And she covers him with a blanket. She kind of covers him twice. She covers him with a blanket. He says, I'm thirsty. Please give me some water. But notice she doesn't give him water. She gives him milk. What does milk do? It makes you sleepy. So she gives him milk and covers him up again, probably like tucks him in. Stand in the doorway of the tent, he told her. If someone comes by and asks you, is anyone there, say no. Now, I've got this in bold because this is, for the author of Judges, this is meant to be funny. It's meant to be ironic. Because what the author of Judges is telling us is, Sisera tells her, if somebody comes to the tent door and asks if anybody is in here, say no. Essentially what he's telling her is to lie. Now what's going to happen is she is going to kill him. So there is no longer going to be a living person, a living man inside the tent. So she won't have to lie. When somebody comes and says, is anyone in there? She can say no because now somebody is dead in there. So this is kind of this ironic twist for the author of Judges that I'm sure the author of Judges thought was very funny amidst all the rest of this biblical violence. Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the tent peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. At this time, they're living like a nomadic lifestyle. A man's job was to just be the host. That was literally, the man's job was to be the host of the tent. It was actually the women's jobs to set up the tents when they traveled around. So Jael would have been extremely skilled with the hammer and a tent peg. In fact, it would have been the only thing she would have been skilled out as far as weapons. So she grabs the only thing she knows how to use, weapon-wise, and uses it here. There's some more portrayals here of Jael and Sisera. This one's a little more disturbing. It's got Sisera, he's awake. From the artist portrayal here. He's got his eyes open as this is happening to him. Probably even more, a little more disturbing than an actual photograph that people, an artist took, people reenacting this. And it's a little more disturbing when it's a photograph because it becomes a little more real, I think, in our mind here of just exactly what's happening. You know, in English, we translate it as temple. She drove the tent peg through his temple. The word that's used there is actually something more like parted lips. So in other words, she probably drove the tent peg through his mouth, which would have severed his spinal column, and he would have had an extremely convulsive, violent, painful death, is the picture that's given here of what Jael does to Sisera here. Which is interesting. I mean, if Jael knows who Sisera is, you know, she's, for all we know, she's the only one here. Her husband is not there. We know that. We're not told of anybody else around, and yet she invites a known rapist into her tent. We know he's a rapist because he has spent 20 years with these chariots conquering all these other people groups around them and taking women as plunder and spoils at the end of that. And so she invites him into her tent, and then does what probably few of us would want to do, or think about doing. And then, just then, Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I'll show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, or mouth, dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. So remember, Sisera was the general. Once this army is destroyed, the Israelites pursue even more Jabin, the king, who Sisera served, and eventually defeat him under Deborah's leadership after this event that happens with Jael. Remember again that at the beginning of our story, Barak comes and says, "Hey, Deborah, if you go with me, I'll go. But if you're not going to go, I'm not going to go." And she says, "Okay, but because you won't go without me going, then Sisera is going to be delivered not into your hands. In other words, the glory is not going to be yours. He's going to be delivered into the hands of a woman." Now, everybody at that point in the story would assume it meant Deborah, that Deborah would be the one that Sisera would fall into the hands of. But it's actually this woman, Jael, who is the one that Sisera is delivered into. So we get back to our song of Deborah. "Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, and most blessed of tent-dwelling women. He asked for water, she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell, there he lay. At her feet he sank, he fell, where he sank, there he fell, dead." Again, the author of Judges is really driving it home here for us. But the words he uses there, hammered, crushed, smashed, stoved in, these are all like translations of what the Hebrew words say there. And then for Sisera, sank down, fell, lay still, sank and fell, sank down, fell, slain. Notice where he's at in this version. At her feet he sank. In the Hebrew, it actually says something like between her legs. The picture there is a woman crouches to give birth at this time, and the baby falls. And then a mother would give the baby milk. They would cover the baby. All the things Jael is doing here. That he falls between her legs. He falls. She's given him milk. She's covered him up. That's the picture that's happening here for the author of Judges. The other idea of being between her legs is basically pointing out once again for the author of Judges, the irony that's happening here. Normally Sisera, when he goes into battle, he defeats the enemy, and he is between women's legs as he rapes them and takes them as spoils and plunder. Here he is between a woman's legs, and he's the one that's been defeated. He's the one that's been killed. So now all of a sudden the Song of Deborah, kind of cruelly, unless you're an Israelite celebrating this event, which they were, flips over to the scene of Sisera, the general who has just had a tent peg driven through his mouth. It flips over to his mother. What must his mother be thinking about what's happening? Notice the words here. "Through the window peered Sisera's mother." Remember when we talked about Rahab, that I pointed out that she was peering through a window. She was looking through a window, and that phrase is only used in the Bible of high society women. One of the examples I gave was Sisera's mother here. If he's a general, certainly his mother is rich and well off at this point. Behind the lattice she cried out, "Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why is the clatter of his chariots delayed?" So of course she's wondering, hey, normally he's back sooner than this. Normally it's a quick victory. He's back, but, where is he? Why is he delayed in coming? The wisest of her ladies answered her. Indeed, she keeps saying to herself, "Are they not finding and dividing the spoils? A woman or two for each man? Colorful garments as plunder for Sisera, colorful garments embroidered, highly embroidered garments for my neck. All this as plunder?" So there's a comparison here between Jael and Sisera's mother. And again, this is if you're an Israelite celebrating this event, which they did, you're going to compare and contrast the two. Jael, the hero of the story, with Sisera. And the telling this story from the point of view of Sisera's mother is just kind of this final taunting, basically, in this story to claim this, great victory for the Israelite people of what has happened here, that their enemies have been defeated after they called out on God to defeat their enemies. And again, the picture here, notice in this event, a womb or two for every man. So this is something, oddly enough, that Sisera's mother and the other women there were kind of celebrating, like, oh, he's probably not back yet, because they're basically, the picture, they're busy raping women as plunder and spoils after their victory. And for the author of Judges, again, this is the twist, the irony in the story is, whereas normally, or Sisera has been penetrated with the tent peg through parted lips. Whereas normally he's the one penetrating parted lips, he's now been penetrated his parted lips. The tent peg being driven through his mouth into his spinal column. So again, this is the twist for the author of Genesis here, the irony of what's happening in this story. In our story with Deborah here, God defeats the Canaanites. It's setting up the further spiritual decline of Israel. Deborah's kind of the peak of the judges in terms of being a good person, essentially. Like, Deborah's kind of the peak. We get to Gideon, Jephthah, finally Samson as the last of the judges. It goes downhill from there. When I talked about there's a few jerks and idiots of the judges, these are who I'm talking about. So it goes, this is a decline spiritually for the people of Israel. As this time goes on, they get more and more used to living amongst these foreign people and worshiping their gods and goddesses. Not only do they spiritually decline, but their leaders spiritually decline as well. But we're going to talk about the good news of that is that God still uses people who are broken saviors, and which should be good news for all of us. So the right leadership here, she's kind of the perfect prophet, held up in that esteem. The picture of Deborah and Barak is, kind of a similar picture of Moses and Miriam. That kind of combination there in leading the people of Israel. Are there any questions or comments on Deborah or Jael? You're probably like, no, I want to forget that. Okay, we're going to watch another 3-minute little fractured fairy tale version of Deborah's story, and then we'll end the night with one last part of Deborah and Jael's story. So, Jerry, you got the video?
Although the children of Israel had conquered much of the land, the Canaanites oppressed them, and the general Sisera continued to march forward. No one person had taken it upon themselves to defeat Sisera. For who could? Not just any random citizen.
Who are you calling random?
But could a general? Or a prophet?
Barak,
What is it this time?
you must take 10,000 men to the Kishon River, where you will find Sisera and his army. God will deliver him into your hands.
Sisera, have you seen his army? Iron chariots. What do we have compared to that?
God,
Okay, we'll go. But only if you come with us.
I'll come along, but know this, the victory will not belong to you. People will say that a woman defeated Sisera. Rise! This is the day that God gives Sisera into your hands.
Every last one of the Canaanites was destroyed, except one.
I gotta get out of here.
Exhausted, Sisera arrived at a random citizen's tent, looking for help.
I'm not random. I have a stake in this matter.
Haber, I need help.
My husband's not home. What's wrong?
The battle. The Israelites are decimating us. Tell your husband we need his help. It's time for you to choose sides.
Oh, we've chosen sides.
We're just letting him get away?
He won't get away.
I thought you
I
would.
said a woman would finish him. I didn't say it would be me.
Thanks for letting me hide here.
Shh. Just get some sleep.
I just thank you for the milk. If anyone comes to your tent and asks if there's a man here, you must say, there is no one.
So, because of one random citizen, with the incredible act by the amazing Yael, the land was at peace for 40 years, until the Israelites started sinning again, lost God's favor, got conquered, turned back to God, and started the cycle of judges all over again in Gideon versus the Midianites.
And that's where we'll pick up next week. We got a few more minutes tonight. I want to close out the story of Deborah and Jael here. We'll pick up with Gideon and Jephthah and Samson next week. But this is a church in Jerusalem. It's called Dormition Abbey. It is called that because it is one of the traditional sites of the death of Mary, the mother of Jesus, where she fell asleep, where she died. This is downstairs. Just out of frame here at the bottom is kind of this cherry wood carving of Mary laying there. But above her is this. Here's a closer look. It's got Jesus in the middle. This is above Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's got Jesus in the middle, and then he's surrounded by 6 women. Here is Eve. You see the snake, the fruit. In this version, that looks like a apple or peach or something, but she's got fruit in her hand. That's Eve. Then we have Miriam. There she is with her like timbrel tambourine, singing the song of Miriam from Exodus chapter 15. We have Queen Esther is one of the women that is surrounding Jesus here above Mary, the mother of Jesus, Queen Esther. Ruth, whose story we'll get to in a couple weeks. There she is with the wheat from the threshing floor that she's holding there. And one of the women above Mary, the mother of Jesus, there she is. There's Jael holding the hammer, and she's got a tent peg there that she's holding. This is one of the celebrated women that is surrounding Jesus as he is overseeing his mother's sleeping or death there as portrayed in this church. The 6th woman is here. And you want to know who she is? If you've been there with me, you might know who this is. Her name is Judith. Now, she's not in our Protestant Bibles. If you grew up Catholic and you have a Catholic Bible, you have the book of Judith in your Bible and the story of Judith here. It is a story celebrated in Catholicism. It is also, her story is celebrated by the Jewish people in Judaism. Here's one of the more famous pictures of Judith. Now, what's interesting about Judith is she's the third person. The third person called most blessed among women. So you have Mary, the mother of Jesus, you have Jael, and you have this woman, Judith. Now, Judith's story is that this is during the time of King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. He is persecuting the Israelite people in the Promised Land. Many of the other tribes are falling under, bowing down to him as he conquers them. His army, under a general named Holofernes, lays siege to a city that Judith is living in. Eventually, the elders of the town are talking, and they're like, we only got 5 days left. We only got 5 days of food and water. After 5 days, we have to surrender. We have to give up. Judith overhears this and becomes indignant at them that they would have such little faith. And she is described as this young, beautiful woman. She's a widow. She's lost her husband. But she is upset with them for not having faith that God would deliver them from this siege, from this general Holofernes. So her plan becomes, she goes to the camp where Holofernes is at with all his soldiers and convinces him that she has defected from the Israelite people. And basically her plan is, I'm going to go get him to fall in love with me. So indeed, over at the camp, this is from the book of Judith, Holofernes was greatly pleased with her, and he drank a great quantity of wine, much more than he had ever drunk in one day since he was born. In the Jewish practice, if you have Jewish friends, you might know that at Hanukkah time, there's a couple things that they eat, like traditional foods they eat. They eat jelly donuts or other stuff like fried in oil, like latkes, like potato latkes. That's celebrating the miracle of the oil that the story of Hanukkah is about. But the other thing a lot of Jewish families do at Hanukkah time is they eat dairy products, cheese, danishes, stuff like that. And it comes from this story of Judith, that she gives Holofernes wine and cheese, basically, just like Jael giving milk. It's to make him tired. So Judith was left alone in the tent with Holofernes stretched out on his bed, for he was overcome with wine. So everyone went out, and no one, either small or great, was left in the bedchamber. So they're in there alone. Then Judith, standing beside his bed, said in her heart, O Lord God of all might, look in this hour upon the work of my hands for the exaltation of Jerusalem. For now is the time to help thy inheritance and to carry out my undertaking for the destruction of the enemies who have risen up against us. She went to the post at the end of the bed above Holofernes' head. Some of you probably already know where this is going. And took down his sword that hung there. She came close to his bed and took hold of the hair of his head and said, Give me strength this day, O Lord God of Israel. And she struck his neck twice with all her might and severed it from his body. Then she tumbled his body off the bed. Adding insult to injury here. She tumbled his body off the bed and pulled down the canopy from the post. After a moment, she went out and gave Holofernes' head to her maid. I just like to be the maid. Like, no thanks. Like, you carry it. Who placed it in her food bag. Hopefully she's not using that for lunch later. Then the two of them went out together as they were accustomed to go for prayer. They passed through the camp and circled around the valley and went up the mountain to Bethulia and came to its gates. So they go back to the city that they lived in that had been laid siege to. So here's Judith approaching. Here's a much more graphic version of this. I just think the artist's rendition of Judith in this is always funny to me. Like, she looks like she's even surprised at how gruesome it is. Like, her face is like, I didn't think there was going to be that much blood. Notice in these two pictures, the maid is standing behind her. This artist actually has the maid helping her subdue Holofernes, which is kind of an interesting choice. It does make you think, like, how would Judith overpower this man unless she had the maid helping her? This one just seems cruel. This portrayal here, putting the head in the food bag with the headless body just sitting there. But the picture here of them walking away, it says that they went out as they always go to prayer. So basically, they stuff his head in this food bag, and they walk out, and with all the guards and soldiers and everyone else around, there's like, we're just going to pray, just like we normally do. And they leave the camp. And then, of course, they go back to their own camp there. We don't have time to read through all this, but basically she goes back, she shows the head to everybody at the camp and basically tells them, look, just as I said, God has delivered Holofernes into our hand and defeated our enemies. So why do we talk about this? Because she is the third woman called most blessed among women. We have Mary, the mother of Jesus, and we have Jael, and we have Judith. And the thing that they all have in common is that they all crushed the head of the enemy. Now, for Jael and Judith, that's obvious. You know, driving the tent peg through the mouth or cutting off the head is crushing the head of the enemy. But Mary, the mother of Jesus, how would that be? If you look at Genesis chapter 3, it says, the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, gives birth to the one who crushes the head of the enemy. Paul says the God of peace will soon crush Satan. I'll end with this idea that there's good news here. If you want to be considered by God most blessed among women, most blessed among men, you do not have to drive a tent peg through the face of a general. You do not have to hack off the head of a king, and you don't have to give birth to the King of Kings. Paul tells us, be wise about what is good and innocent about what is evil, and the God of peace will soon crush Satan underneath your feet. So we'll pick up next week with the story of Gideon. We'll talk about a judge briefly named Jephthah, and then we'll spend most of next week talking about Samson. Probably a story a lot of you are at least somewhat familiar with, but we'll really dig into his story and the very strangeness of the story of Samson as well next week as we get through the rest of the book of Judges, maybe going into week 6 before we finish with Ruth. So thanks for being here. Hope to see you, those of you online, again next week, and those of you here in person, hope to see you again next week. So thanks for being here.